So before we start, do you have any other questions for me to clarify things?
Only that you said there that I might suggest someone else you would interview.
Yes.
And Roberto, he is a psychologist at the University of Madrid. It may be called something strange like the Autonomous University of Madrid. But he's a psychologist there, and he is very knowledgeable about recent research into the relationship between brain physiology and intelligence. He sends me stuff in emails, but I know him as an old friend. And he is a very good scholar, and as I say, he's quite up to date in an area that I'm not. And that is the most recent techniques of trying to image the brain and try and connect what's going on in the brain with what's going on in your conscious mind.
Well, that's an interesting suggestion. That was actually my very last question of the interview, but that's fine, that's fine. I'm calling you from the Netherlands, and I was curious, in your last book, Does Your Family Make You Smarter? You referred to IQ research to models of intelligence. You referred to Sternberg, whom I talked to you.
That's right. The last half of the book is really on, I think I'm responsible for a certain revolution in the theory of intelligence. That when I started writing about the theory of intelligence in my first book with Cambridge, that was in 2007, entitled What is Intelligence? And then right up through my last book, which is the one you're referring to with Cambridge, which is Does Your Family Make You Smarter? I began questioning the current theory of intelligence in that it was entirely based on G, the general intelligence factor. And I convinced people that really the various subtests of the Wechsler were highly significant independently of G. And that if we wanted a valid theory of intelligence, we had to take these subtests seriously and not just ask how G-loaded is this subtest. Mm-hmm. We had to look at them as indicative of different trends in intelligence over time and explain what was happening on them one by one. And that created, I think, a sea change in people's attitude towards the theory of intelligence. And I tried to sum up my latest views on the theory of intelligence in the second half of the book you read.
Yes. So you referred to Sternberg's theory, to Gardner's theory, Jensen, and you refer to research from the University of Amsterdam as well. So could you elaborate?
Yes, I do. I think there's. Do you know Tidjanahi Hui? Tidjanahi Hui. It's Jan. I have trouble pronouncing his name, but he, I think, is connected to the University of Amsterdam, and I've on occasion collaborated with him.
And so you just spent a couple of lines in your book on their research, but could you elaborate a bit more about that, especially since I'm producing an article for Dutch readers? It would be really interesting to know how the Netherlands are contributing to this field of knowledge.
Well, are you referring to the article that he and I published in Intelligence, which was called something like the Flynn paradox resolved through four something or another samples? Is that the article you're referring to?
No, it's chapter 10 of your book, theories, scientific theories.
Yes, that article I think is very important. You know, some psychologists still are fixated on G theory. And you know what they say, IQ gains over time would be significant if the gains were proportionate to the G loading of the subtest. You know, they say what we want are IQ gains where there's very little gain on something like rote memory,
yes,
which is not a very complex operation. And then there's a bigger gain on, let's say, digit span backwards, where you don't just repeat the digit, you know, in the order, but back. And then we want a bigger gain, let's say, on Raven's progressive matrices. And IQ gains aren't like that. They tend to be on all of the subtests, but they don't correlate nicely with the G loading of the subtest. And sometimes they tend to be dismissive and say, oh, these are just piecemeal gains. They're not general intelligence gains. Well, I have two answers to that. First, even if they're piecemeal, they're highly significant. If you make a big gain among adults on vocabulary, it's socially significant in that people have a wider range of conversation and converse about more serious topics.
Yes.
So whether vocabulary is G-loaded or not has nothing to do with its social significance. But the other thing I noticed was something very interesting, and that is if you compare normal subjects with subjects who clearly have an intellectual handicap. Let's say they are subjects that have been affected by cocaine, they have been subjects that have been affected by brain trauma, they are subjects that are affected by fetal alcohol syndrome, and you compare these subjects with normal subjects, there's no G pattern. That is, the difference between normal subjects and these people who are clearly less intelligent is random. It doesn't say, oh, normal subjects will be better than they are on the most highly G-loaded test, and, small on the lowest G-loaded test. They're all over the place.
I see.
And this seemed to me a very convincing refutation to the notion that G is a proxy for intelligence. Because how can you reconcile that hypothesis with the fact that when you take normal people with people who are clearly brain damaged, or clearly dysfunctional for intelligence, the subtests just don't line up like G theory wants them to. And the fellow at the Netherlands and I and one of his associates collaborated on it. Now, if you look in the index of my book, you will find an article under Flynn, which is something like Flynn, Tage and House and someone else, that's published in Intelligence. And it's entitled, Flynn's Paradox Explained in 4 Data Sets. That's my closest collaboration with people in Holland.
I see. I was also very curious about the fact that in your book you refer mostly to the Wechsler test and the Stanford-Binet test.
They're the two standard IQ tests throughout the world, along with Raven.
Yes, but there are so many differences between IQ tests. In Holland we have the NEO test, for example, and how, for heaven's sake, can you compare...
Well, that test, describe that test to me. What subtest does that test have? Is it divided into subtests?
It's divided into subtests as well, spatial and numerical.
Well, then you see it very much resembles then the Wechsler test.
Yes.
Spatial and numerical. The subtest doesn't have much on spatial, but presumably your test in Holland has a verbal section too.
As well, yes. It has a verbal part as well, but research shows that in Holland, there are differences between intelligence tests. I mean, so it's really hard. What kind of test do you use when you do all these when you collect all these metadata to assess whether the Flynn-effect is wearing out, for example? How do you know our tests are reliable?
Well, the only thing you can do is give your subtest and the Wechsler subtest to the same group of subjects and find out whether the item hierarchies are similar. If the hardest item on your test is very like the hardest item on the Wechsler test, you go right down the line, and you find that the two are, you can also just figure a correlation coefficient. That is, you take the rank order of people who do best to worst on your test, and the rank order of people who do best to worst on the Wechsler test, and you find out that they're the same people. And that's an indication that the cognitive skills being tested are fairly similar. I would think it almost unbelievable that someone in Holland hasn't done such a study, but I'm not familiar with it.
Well, there are people.
I mean, psychologists. Yes, I would think that they would find that the correlation between your test and the Wechsler would be at least 0.8.
Okay, I don't know that exact number, but I know there are people. One of them his name is Henk van Dijk, and he designed an IQ test which has a correlation with the WISC test. So there is research going on.
What's the correlation? Do you remember the correlation?
No, I mean it shows it has the same subtests as well.
Yes, and they can correlate subtests too.
Yeah.
But and you can take, let's say you have a vocabulary subtest and the WISC has a vocabulary subtest.
Yeah.
And once again, you can give them to the same group of subjects in counterbalanced order, and you find the people who do best on the WISC vocabulary test tend to do the best on yours.
Yeah.
And I would be quite amazed if he doesn't find that the correlation coefficient between the two is at least about 0.75 or 0.8.
Yes.
The beauty about my book is that the first half of it
Yes.
finds an alternative method to the twin study
Yes.
of partitioning between genes and environment. And, you know, I'd always been a bit skeptical of the twin studies, and then I devised my own independent method, and damned if they weren't very close indeed. You know, the partitioning between genes and environment that I got on my method, the age table method, was very close to the twin studies. There's a table in there that shows that. But mine is good in that I can go subtest by subtest and do a very accurate calculation of the relationship between genes and environment, let's say on arithmetic is different from vocabulary. And you get some of that in the twin literature, but not much. And, you know, I can say, for example, that on the arithmetic subtests, the preponderance of environment over genes disappears by about the age of 10. While on vocabulary, the preponderance of environment, at least the residue of environment compared to genes goes all the way up to the early 20s. Now that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? When your kid goes into school, some parents have taught them to count and add and subtract. So difference between family will be an enormous influence up to about the age of 5. And then when they go into school, everyone learns arithmetic. And the kid who is genetically more able tends to forge ahead. So by the age of 10, environment is much reduced in influence than schooling or peer groups. But with vocabulary, unless you, of course, stop talking to your parents as a teenager, you keep being bathed in the vocabulary environment of your home. And that competes with the vocabulary environment set by your peer group. So vocabulary is a stayer. It only begins to be really overshadowed by genes, you know, in your early 20s. And that, as I say, has great consequences. Because in America, to get into university, you have to take, you know, the SAT.
Yeah.
The SAT reading is the thing they look at. And even at the age of 18, someone from a deprived home, the lingering influence of the home is great enough that it circumscribes their choice of university.
Yeah. You proposed a new theory of intelligence, the Dickens-Flynn model. Apart from Sternberg and Gardner's and...
Oh, the Dickens-Flynn model. Well, that's a whole different ball game, but it dovetails in with what I'm saying. That is, if you look at the Dickens-Flynn model, it has both the social multiplier and the individual multiplier, right?
Yes.
Well, the individual multiplier predicts that when you look within groups, that is, within a cohort, and you're not looking at between groups, let's say black and white, but you're looking within groups, you will find that genes will slowly absorb environment. That is, genes are with you throughout your life, aren't they?
Yes.
While your environment varies. Take a kid who is genetically good at basketball. He's tall and has a fast reflex arc. And he'll be the kid who matches a correspondingly rich environment. He'll be selected to play sandlot basketball. He'll be selected for his grade school team and get more coaching. He'll be selected for his high school team. And his superior genes match a superior environment. And that is how genes come to dominate the twin studies, because anything correlated with genes is counted in the genetic column. So as you can see that happens, you know, in all sorts of areas, not just IQ, that if you're genetically better at something, it may be, you know, initially it may be one father takes his kid outside and shoots basket and the other one doesn't. So even in basketball, it may seem that family is very predictive at that age. But as the kid ages, the kids' superior genes match a superior environment. And my data, using a method independent of the twin study, shows the same thing. But it also shows it, I think, with equal exactitude and with differentiation between the various cognitive skills. And note the other very important thing that I emphasize there that's often missed, and that is the so-called chance variance. You know, genes eat up environment over about 80% as you go into adulthood, but the 20% is always assigned to random events. You know, you're dropped on your head, your brain is injured in a traffic accident, you get encephalitis, and I point out that chance variance could just as easily be measuring someone's autonomy. You know, that 20% means that in adulthood, you're not entirely at the mercy of your genes and your fading childhood environment. You can also say to yourself, I'm pretty bored with the people I'm associating with, I'm going to go back to university. And that may boost your IQ by as much as a standard deviation.
That's amazing.
Let's say you marry someone who is genetically your superior.
Yes.
Well, they will plunge you into the verbal environment of them and their friends. And you will have an enriched and verbal environment which is actually above your genetic capacity. You see the point? That choice would fit under chance environment. Well, it's not chance at all. You may have been a girl who only respected men who seemed more intelligent than she did.
So that's what you call absorbing, genes absorbing the environment. I mean, I talked to Charles Murray last month, and he refers to this phenomena as being in the body.
To Charles Murray, did you? Yes, he's an old friend.
I asked him, do you have any unasked questions for Dr. Flynn? And he, well, maybe you read his statement. He said, no unasked questions to suggest we have cheerfully agreed to disagree about most things. So, is that in fact true?
Yes, and by most things, he means things like the race and IQ debate. You know, we're on the net. We've debated, Charles Murray and I, twice on race and IQ.
Yeah, in 2006.
Once in New York and once in Washington.
Yes, yes.
We agreed to disagree, but I don't think, I think he was quite impressed with my last book on the analysis of IQ variance. That is, he certainly didn't. Maybe he wasn't, but we haven't ironed out differences in terms of G theory, if you know what I mean. We might be much closer together on G theory than we are on race and IQ.
Yeah, well, one of his most famous statements, and well, I'd like to talk about education. He says in his book, Real Education, the United States are selling a lie. The lie that everybody can become whoever they want to be, just if they try hard enough. And he says, because you have this innate genes, IQ, it's for some people impossible to become whoever you like to be. So you'll have to agree on that.
We certainly agree that while effort and persistence is important, there's a limit. Even with the greatest effort and persistence in the world, I would not have been an Einstein. You know?
Yes.
I don't have the genetic quality. But I'm not sure how he reacted to my business, however, that there may be a much greater tude for human autonomy and IQ variance than most people have recognized. I've never discussed that subject with him.
So now we are in the field of education, and one of my questions is, how do you look at education today? What's your opinion? And you can pick...
Let's look at one thing.
Yes.
One of the things that my researchers showed, and it was hardly a new discovery, is that when I researched gender, you know, I ran into Lynn, who claims that women are genetically inferior for IQ to men.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his most impressive bodies of data was comparing university students. And lo and behold, when I looked at it, I thought, gee, among university students, the average IQ of men is about 2.5 points above that of women. And then I said to myself, but these aren't random samples. That is, a woman with an IQ of 100 gets A's and B's at school,
Yes.
and a man with an IQ of 100 tends to get B's and C's. So clearly, the threshold for women going to university is less than for men. Now, clearly, the difference between men and women there has to do not with genes for intelligence, or even perhaps so much with home environment, is that women are just more amenable to the school atmosphere and try harder.
Well, that's an opinion most people hold, in the Netherlands as well. I mean, school was more suitable for girls.
Yes, it shows that autonomy enters into it. I mean, the woman is more likely to be more docile and to do what the educational system wants.
Exactly.
And men are obviously likely to have more testosterone. They're likely to be more rebellious.
If you have to reflect on education today for men and women, for everybody, what do you see?
Well, I have two things to say about education today. One is in the book that I'll be publishing in September with Emerald Press in Britain.
All right.
And it's a look at universities. And it's entitled In Defense of Free Speech, The University is Censor. And it points out that in university today, everyone is scared of controversial ideals, ideas. There's an atmosphere of conformity, that very few people are acquiring the information and knowledge and critical intelligence they need to go with their high IQ. And I say far more important than whether IQ continues to rise over the next 100 years is whether we educate people with the IQs that developed over the 20th century. That is, can we do a better job of educating them critically and giving them the information and reading skills that they need to become independent thinkers? And that will be far more influential on the quality of intellect over the next century than whether IQ stalls or not. The whole book is about things we could do with universities to make them less conformist and make them less antagonistic to diversity of opinion.
You have experienced this firsthand in the past because you were fired twice because of some personal opinions you had, political ideas.
Yes, I was bounced a few times, but that was in the old days. It amuses me, the left today, and quite rightly I think in some cases, is supposed to censor out ideas that conflict with left-wing things like racial equality. When I was at the university, it was the right wing that was in control. And I was bounced in the American South for being too friendly to blacks, and I was bounced in the American North for believing in socialized medicine. So the reign of terror was just the opposite. That is, it was anyone who had maverick ideas on the left that was being suppressed. Yeah. Well, today it tends to be, not entirely, people with maverick ideas on the right, like Charles Murray.
Yeah.
And they're the ones suppressed. So I have a whole range of suggestions in there as to how universities might encourage freedom of speech much more than they do today.
Yeah, you talked about two main ideas. Two main ideas. The first one you just explained, and what's the second one?
Well, a lot of things they could do. They could be more like the University of Chicago and less like Yale and Harvard. When Chicago admits a student gets a letter. And it says, when you go to university, you're going to find a lot of ideas upset you, and that's how you intellectually grow. We don't abolish invitations to speakers. We don't have a speech code. Naturally, you're supposed to be civil to one another, but you're not to go around reporting each other all the time for, using the term wetback. It doesn't use that illustration. And Chicago still invites students to come there, and they still confront challenging issues like race and IQ. They still confront challenging issues like whether the pay gap between men and women has sociological causes that are not entirely discriminatory. Yale and Harvard, they tend to be leery of discussing basic ideals or basic problems that are unpopular. They also, Princeton is the same, by the way, they also have speech codes. They have organized groups that if you want to invite a speaker and they don't like them, they manage to get the invitation withdrawn. There are a whole range of practices going on at universities where students essentially bully staff into silence. And the administrators, all they want is a quiet life. Over half of the courses in America today are taught by adjunct professors. Do you know who they are?
No.
Well, adjunct professors, universities are now expensive, and they hire on the cheap people to teach courses who have no tenure and are highly vulnerable. And these are called adjunct professors, and they can be fired if they make one slip of the tongue in class.
Wow.
And a student reports them as being racist or sexist. And that, of course, means that over half of university courses in America tend to be taught by people who are terrified of raising any controversial issue or saying anything that might offend any student.
The student is in fact in power.
Pardon?
The students decide. The
students are effectively in power, and of course this sets up a certain atmosphere in the university. Adjunct professors have said they have no chance of getting tenure if they say something offensive, but they have no chance if they are also going to ask the students to meet stringent educational requirements. There's a peace treaty between the lecturers and the students. The students say, don't trouble us with making the course too tough, and we'll give you praiseworthy evaluations so you'll get ahead. And that suits everybody, doesn't it? The student can neglect the course and merely fiddle around and right before the exam look at the course outline and answer questions from it and get an A or a B. And the lecturer isn't terrified by being dismissed, and everybody is happy. It's a sort of hedonic pact.
Please continue.
Students are happy because you're not making any demands on their leisure time, and they can enjoy their booze and their sex and their sports. And you're happy because you don't get an unfavorable reference that keeps you from getting tenure.
It sounds like the same is happening in secondary schools. It's called punitive accountability.
That's right. The same thing can happen there too. And even worse, in America, one of the departments that is most ideological, I talk in the book about, first, what other people do to academics, meaning administrators and students. Then I talk about what academics do to themselves, because there are certain departments in universities that have very little scholarly integrity, and they're mainly ideological. There are many exceptions, of course, but the typical black studies department is trying to turn out a crusader who believes that, who is against assimilation of blacks and believes in some type of ill-defined black revolution. And women's studies departments, they're not seriously interested in looking at all the factors that mean that women have lower pay than men. They just say, oh, it's all male prejudice, it's all male prejudice. In teacher training institutions within the university, in their charters, they say essentially we're sending out missionaries who believe in justice and equality, and will turn the school system into a mirror of this ideal world. And the effect on the schools is horrific. That is, the schools won't rank anybody, they withhold who is better than who else in their skills. They sit around and chat about social issues rather than learning what they need to learn to go to university.
So I refer to Chomsky as well. So do you share his view? To Noam Chomsky.
Look, I don't know Chomsky.
Okay.
And my impression is that in his linguistics department, there was a party line, and if you weren't a Chomskyist, you weren't very welcome. But that could be slanderous. But I know that in many departments, that's the case. If you're in an education department, you can't take IQ seriously because it ranks people. If you're in an anthropology department in America, you can't take Piaget seriously because Piagetians compare societies at different levels of development in terms of how mature their thinking is, and that's supposed to be wicked. If you are in a psychology department, you don't teach a course on race and IQ. If you're in a politics department, it's often considered too explosive to discuss Israel versus the Palestinians. Causes a lot of trouble, doesn't it? So you can go through department after department. It isn't just black studies and women's studies and, teacher training. These other disciplines have what I tend to call a Walden Code. Well, it's an ideal society, but it's based on a code that says what's allowed and what isn't. And many American departments have an unwritten code which tells young researchers what they'll be penalized for saying and doing and what they can get away with. And anyone who's in teacher's training who is an advocate of IQ tests will find that they're bounced pretty quick. And anyone who discusses the race and IQ issue in a psych department in America will find they don't get tenure. So even outside black studies and women's studies and teacher education, there are these informal codes as to what you can get away with as a researcher and teacher and what you can't.
Talking about informal codes, you refer to the military as well as the intervention in Iraq, and you said if only soldiers knew what was going on really between countries and the history of Iraq and Iran, they would come to different conclusions. But you have to agree with me, Dr. Flynn, that they are not taught these courses on Westpoint. I mean, why should the military do that? They want people who don't think.
You mean at Westpoint?
Westpoint, you know, the military...
Well, Westpoint has a peculiar function. I mean, it's to turn out people who conquer their fear of death and command troops in the field. And I'm not sure that you can say that the curriculum that would be ideal at every university would be ideal at Westpoint if people were sufficiently critical. Soldiers are supposed to obey politicians.
Exactly.
If people who graduated from Westpoint were sufficiently critical, they would probably find that it raised a crisis of consciousness to obey politicians.
Yes.
Have you ever seen my comments on the Iraq War and how students are not educated to have a critical attitude towards it? I'm talking about my reference to the 30 Years' War. You know, people had a proper historical background. They would say, Westerners have interfered in the Middle East dozens of times and have always done more harm than good.
Yes.
And they would say, look back to the 30 Years' War when an enlightened sultan would invade Germany and try and make them all be happy and live together and nation build. We would say that this was absolutely insane. And yet countries keep doing this in the Middle East, you know, saying, oh, we're going here to make Sunnis and Shias love each other and nation build, as if they could possibly do such a thing. And it's a good illustration of how very few students in American universities often go beyond a vocational curriculum and get the history and get the habit of reading critical literature that they need to be good citizens.
Well, a great metaphor for this would be Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, because I think when you want to develop your brain to the fullest potential, you should pay attention to music, you should pay attention to movement, because it stimulates the neurons in your brain to make connections, right? And I think the same goes for learning of vocation. If you want to learn a vocation and you want to do a good job, you have to know about world politics. You have to know about ethics. You have to learn.
Are you familiar with Tawney's book, The Acquisitive Society, R.H. Tawney? He wrote several books, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Equality, but the best is The Acquisitive Society. And he comments on how we train managerial elite. And he says, you know, it's curious. Every profession but them is supposed to have a code of ethics that eliminates self-seeking. You know, a doctor takes the Hippocratic Oath. A lawyer takes essentially an oath not to use their skills just to cheat their clients. But people in business school are told that businesses are only responsible to their stockholders, that there's no moral code that limits the amount of harm they can do. And, you know, he would say most management schools, if they teach you about business ethics, it's how to hire a competent accountant who keeps you from being thrown in jail.
It reminds me.
They don't teach a business code of ethics.
Well, no, they don't.
Do no harm.
It reminds me of the book Kapital in the 21st Century. Maybe you know the book. It's Thomas Piketty. You know his work?
Yes.
Did
he write? There was a book that came out that argued that the typical psychology of a corporation was that of a sociopath. A sociopath, of course, is someone who has no morality.
Exactly.
And, he argued the notion that who would say that the doctor is only responsible to increasing his own income?
Well, that's insane.
And yet, every business executive is told you're responsible. I'm doing a book now for next year on it's called The Shape of Things to Come. And at present, I'm looking at America, which probably, as you know, it forbids certain chemicals and lead and things as too dangerous in America, and yet sells them abroad. And you talk to the business people, and they say, well, why shouldn't we make a profit abroad? If we don't send dangerous pesticides abroad, someone else will. And so you have all of these people being killed by pesticides because there's no business ethic. People don't say, well, look, you can't do everything to maximize your profit. You do have to stop short of killing people.
So what's your proposal? How do we solve this problem? Because it's kind of a David...
My proposal is, I think that over the next century in America, American psychology is going to evolve in a social democratic direction. So that Americans may evolve much more the psychology of Finland or Sweden or Denmark. And I would like to know, do the Danes sell dangerous things overseas that are forbidden on the Danish market?
I don't know.
It'd be worth looking into, wouldn't it?
It would.
Because they shouldn't. I'm sure the Danes know how bad lead paint is for you, don't they?
They do.
Yes. Well, I would be very interested whether Danish manufacturers who are not allowed to sell lead-paste plate in Denmark market it abroad.
Yes, well, I think you're referring to, you'd like to refer to Holland, right? Or you have a specific reason to refer to...
Well, Holland, I don't know either.
Yeah.
I don't know whether... I know that America is notorious for this. It has written into its federal statutes that things that are forbidden to be sold in America can be sold abroad as long as the host country allows them in.
I mean, a chief example is the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, of course, and also pesticide industry.
Exactly.
Pesticides are sold by American corporations overseas that everyone is banned as unsafe in America.
So,
and then, of course, there's the dumping of waste material on third world nations because we don't want to store it in our own nation.
In one of your interviews, you said it's good to be isolated, because I think it is, because when you write about these things, some big people are going to try to destroy you, because these voices are not appreciated.
Yes, well, it's as if we said to ourselves, we forbid Murder Incorporated in America. You know, Murder Incorporated will kill people on hire. You're familiar with them?
I know.
Hired assassin.
Yes, I know the name, yes.
Well, there are groups that do, they say, give us $10,000 and we'll kill someone.
Yeah.
Well, of course, this is against the law in America. And I'm sure it's against the law everywhere.
Yes.
And it's as if we said, however, these groups can do business in the third world, because if we don't give them people to commit murder, somebody else will.
Yeah. I'm always thinking when I'm interviewing someone, how is their research applicable for the field I am in? I work in secondary education. You've done extensive research on...
What argument was that? I'm sorry, Jensen? What did you say about Jensen?
No, I was not referring to Jensen. I'm trying to figure out the applicability of your work into Dutch secondary education. What can we do as a society, as an education system, with your research?
Well, let me say this. You're talking about Holland.
I'm talking about Holland, yes.
Yes. Well, I have published an article with Michael Scheer in Intelligence last year on the tendency for IQ gains to stop.
Yes.
You would find that under Flynn and Scheer in Intelligence. Have you read it?
I can't recall, no.
Well, in it, there's a detailed analysis of IQ trends in Holland. And what Holland shows is that the decline of IQ does not affect all age groups. Most of the data is from Scandinavia. These are young adults just out of school going into military service.
Yes.
And I think there is a general trend for those people to lose IQ points because the relationship between young men and school is becoming more and more antagonistic. But if you look at the Dutch data, it's much more complete. You find, for example, that there still seem to be small gains among the adults of 30 who are at work. And that seems to show that work roles in Holland are still getting a little more cognitively demanding. They haven't started yet replacing cognitively demanding jobs with undemanding service work.
Yes. Yeah.
The recruits in Holland have stalled in terms of IQ, and I think that shows the effect of males interfacing with the educational system. The preschoolers in Holland are dead stable, and I think that's because parents have run out of all the things they've been using to hothouse, education at home before the kid goes to school. They aren't any worse at it, but they've probably reached a limit in terms of educational toys and stuff like that. And in virtually every country I've looked at, there's still gains in old age, because this generation of aged people like me, I'm after all now 85,
Yes.
this generation of people, the conditions for health and nutrition and stimulation in old age are still pretty much on the rise everywhere. So it's wrong to just look at Holland and say, have IQ gains stopped? You have to say IQ gains are caused by a multiple group of causes operative at different ages. And at some ages, IQ gains in Holland have stopped. At other ages, they're still going up. And this gives you a much, you'll note I haven't mentioned the sacred name of G.
No, you haven't.
No, you find this out by looking at subtrust trends at different age groups and putting them into sociological context. You don't find it by saying, what are the G gains in Holland?
Yeah.
You say, are they still getting bigger vocabularies or better at mental arithmetic or better at matrices? And you find it varies by age.
Yeah.
And of course it varies in terms of the factors that are operative at various ages. But I still want to exercise my point. It's far more important for the future of Holland whether they do a proper job of educating their citizenry in critical intelligence so they make use of whatever intelligence they've got, rather than whether we have a slight gain in IQ over the next century.
I see. Well, I was wondering how to apply this data into education. What can we in fact do with all this knowledge and statistics?
I would look very carefully at the American experiments in New York. With the traditional curriculum of teaching kids to develop the vocabulary and the numeracy and the history they need to confront the external world pays off much more than having the kids sit on a mat and saying, gee, there's a lot of injustice in the world. Look at how people treat third world nations. Sob, sob, sob. Yeah. I, by the way, am on the left, and I think we treat third world nations badly too. But primary school kids, what are you doing? I mean, it does no good for them to empathize with third world nations unless they have the knowledge and expertise to propose policies that the U.S. government ought to adopt, such as revising NAFTA. I take it you know NAFTA,
yep,
against what most free trade agreements would be, means that you can send subsidized American agricultural products to Mexico. This has driven 3 million Mexican farmers off the land, yes, because they can't match those prices. And they're now, of course, unemployed in Mexican cities. Well, that means that the person has a critical intelligence that can make their sympathy with third world peoples operative. To just sit and say, aren't we being ruled by swine?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And to miss out on learning the vocabulary and the information and the history they need to go on to university and develop critical intelligence. So I would look at the Dutch system and I would say, are they still turning out a numerate and literate population that loves to read history and loves literature? And I would look at Dutch universities and say, are Dutch universities bullying people into silence?
I see. Well, another way of applying the knowledge about IQ is starting to come up nowadays, because there's a trend going on in education, and it's called high ability or giftedness. That means if you have an IQ above,
What's it called?
it's called a giftedness or high ability. And
And are the Dutch schools still challenging kids who do this, or do they just sort of look at them and think how horrible that some people are better than others?
no, what we try to do is that kids who have an IQ higher than 130 are put into special programs so that they develop their talents.
Good. I mean, why shouldn't they?
I was wondering, do you know about giftedness? Do you have a definition yourself?
Oh, giftedness. Well, there's no doubt that I don't think there's a difference in genes for giftedness between black and white, but I do think there's a difference in genes for giftedness within a particular group. I think I am more gifted in terms of verbal fluency than the average university teacher. I think that my son is far more gifted than I am in terms of mathematics. He's professor of pure maths at Oxford.
I see.
So there are differences in giftedness, and it would be stupid to ignore these and to bore kids who are extremely gifted with giving them the same curriculum you give kids who are well below them in giftedness.
When is someone gifted?
I think it's important. When are they gifted?
Yes.
Well, the best way to tell whether they're gifted is how quickly they learn material compared to others and how thoroughly. I wouldn't use an IQ test to test how gifted they are. If you give them, let's say, introductory mathematics, the kids who shine on that are obviously more competent to deal with intermediate algebra. And if they shine on intermediate algebra, they're obviously more competent to deal with calculus. I mean, kids sort themselves out. No one who isn't gifted in mathematics wants to go to a calculus class and be surrounded by material that they can't learn. So Jensen, by the way, and I agreed on this. He said, rather than using IQ to filter out the gifted,
Yes.
why don't you just look at your curriculum and say if they do well at the intermediate level, they go to the advanced level. Even if they are gifted, if they're totally bored with the subject, of course they won't do well at it. If you want to pick out your gifted kids, you observe in class that, gee, this kid, he picked up, elementary algebra 3 times faster than most kids do.
So you wouldn't attach it to an IQ score?
Well, I don't think that IQ has no role to play in schooling, because let's say you have a kid in class who really seems sharp, but he's underperforming. And you may wonder, I wonder if his family is breaking up.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's some problems at home. And you give them an IQ test, and despite being mediocre, let's say, in writing essays, he knocks the top out of the vocabulary subtest. And you say to yourself, this kid we may need to pay special attention to. He's clearly gifted enough to do better, but his performance doesn't match up to it. And there are probably some emotional problems here. And perhaps we should send him to a school counselor. Jensen says the same thing. He says an IQ test can be a safety net for people who are environmentally underprivileged. And you can have giftedness being interfered with by environmental factors. And
Exactly.
an IQ test can be very useful in picking this out. But he also says if someone is really doing well at intermediate mathematics, you don't keep them from going on to advanced mathematics because of an IQ score. You say if they're that good at intermediate mathematics, they may do better later on. You don't say, oh, gee, their IQ is 130. I guess we won't put them into an advanced math class. So I would use IQ to help kids in difficulty, but I would never use it to penalize a kid who's performing well.
I was wondering, we have this phenomenon going on. Some people believe in so-called singularity. Do you know this phenomenon?
Well, we're supposedly headed for a time, aren't we, when we create artificial intelligence.
Exactly.
And they become autonomous and run us rather than we running them. Isn't that the idea?
That's the idea, and the idea as well that the human brain will eventually be linked up with artificial intelligence. Do you see such a scenario?
That may be true. Let's say in old age my memory starts to slip.
Yes.
Well, then it would be sort of nice to have an implant in my brain that would plug into a computer that remind me of everything that I knew at the age of 50, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Who knows? That might be possible someday. I don't think, however, this machine that enhances my memory is going to develop human traits and think, I'm a mere, exploited worker. I'm like Marx said the proletariat is. All I do is exploit it for a human being. I'm going to figure out some way in which I can become autonomous and create a better power source, and I will indoctrinate human beings with false memories so I will take over the world. I have yet to be convinced that we're on the verge of something of that sort.
Well, what I'm wondering is, I think IQ is part of evolution. We have IQ because we need to function in society. And don't you think that when machinery is taking over our knowledge, I mean our factual thinking,
it certainly is, but I think the major problem of that is that machinery is beginning to duplicate many middle-class job roles. And when the working class was automated out of existence, their kids went into the middle class. When the middle class is automated out of existence, there's nowhere for them to go.
No.
And my view is that eventually societies like Holland and Denmark and the Scandinavian countries will adopt a universal basic wage. They're not going to say to half their population, you're surplus to requirement. For one thing, they need them as consumers, don't they? They can't have consumption fall off by 50%. So a lot of people are going to have to be paid who contribute to society, not so much through normal work roles, but through being good citizens, helping in schools. They could live in houses where people who have had mental problems go to stay as halfway houses, so there's a normal mental environment. They'll be undertaking some of the experiments that are going on in Finland at present. You may be familiar with those.
Yeah, with the universal, with the Finnish basic income.
Yeah, the universal basic wage. So I certainly think machines and automation are going to have an enormous impact, but I'm not worried about the machines saying, gee, I'm reluctant on a human being plugging me into the wall. I think I will create my own electricity source and my own plug so I can plug myself into the wall.
Well, I'm just asking this question because I'm curious if IQ is still going to be relevant if we are linked up to machines. I mean, if machines do all the thinking.
Yes, but I think we'll still be in control. I think we will use machines to enhance our cognitive abilities. I'm not so much a Marxian who thinks machines are alienated from what machines need, and they will bend human beings to their will.
Now that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is IQ going to drop?
No, I mean, this is what a lot of people who talk about the singularity mean. When they talk about the singularity, they talk of the day when the machines can outplan us. They aren't just talking about the fact, can we use machines to enhance our mental abilities?
No. Well, that's a step further. That's a step ahead. I was curious because going back to the Flynn-effect, we see a decline. And maybe when we link up to machines, the decline is even going...
The next step forward is to enhance our mental abilities using machines. As I say, I'm 85.
Yes.
And today I gave my last lecture. I still teach 2 courses full time. And I find that since I was 80, every now and then a few names escape me. I'll try and think of a sociologist at Harvard and I'll have to stop a moment and say to the students, well, his name will come to me in a moment. And if you could plug me into a machine in the lecture theater and my memory was just as good as it was 10 years ago, that would be nice.
So, but in fact, then you would have an external IQ and not an internal IQ.
That's right. Connected to the machine, I would do better on a rote memory test than I would when I'm not connected.
Exactly. So in 100 years, the IQ mean is not going to be 100, but maybe 8.
Yes, my IQ, just as today, almost everyone is adequately fed, and you don't have diet discriminating between people who do on IQ tests. It may be in outrage to people who aren't.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff I don't like about the singularity theorists are the ones who are painting nightmares of, human beings being exterminated by machines. Usually the first step is I'll plug myself in.
Yeah.
And the next step is, well, now that I can plug myself in, what do I need a human being around for?
Well, of course, but I don't want to go there to that scenario. I was just wondering if we are going to see a reverse Flynn effect, where IQs are in fact going to, not to stabilize, but to decline, because our knowledge is in machines.
That may well be the wave of the future. It may be the more we know about brain physiology through Roberto, and the more we know about intelligence-enhancing machines, we may find just what machine could plug into what part of our brain to enhance its functioning.
Yeah.
That could be the future.
I wrote you a question about...
Not my area, by the way. As you can see in my old age, I'm afraid I'm much more of a Renaissance type. That is, I write books on problems that worry me. And what worries me at present, of course, is the climate crisis. I've written a book on that, No Place to Hide, and it's been published in Italy as well as New Zealand. And I'm interested in whether America might take on a less satanic role in the world and the development of American society. And you can't do everything at the age of 85 or you'll die before you do any of it. So I haven't devoted myself to artificial intelligence and its potential.
That's of course the post-Trump era, because as a fact that Trump is advocating for fossil fuel and stuff. It's not going to happen on the short term.
Yes, I couldn't catch the last phrase.
I mean climate change, if they're going to have a less satanic role in climate change.
Oh, climate change, yes, climate change. I mean, this is an incredible problem. I've written No Place to Hide. When I went into this about 10 years ago, I thought, well, I respect the people who are upset more than the people that aren't. But it's an insult to my intelligence and autonomy to have to take someone's word for this. So I researched the material on climate change and found that it was infinitely more serious than I had imagined. And that's why I wrote the book No Place to Hide, to convince people that if we're to avoid runaway climate change, we have to not only do all the good things we're doing, like painting roofs white and getting electric cars, but we would probably have to use some climate engineering. And the only climate engineering that is not terrible is Salter ships. Do you know who Salter and his ships are?
No, I don't.
You don't know them?
No.
Well, Salter proposes having a fleet of 300 ships in the ocean that set up an extra amount of sea spray. Only 1% more than goes up from the ocean now. But the salt sea spray would change the molecular structure of low-lying clouds, and their molecular structure would become more dense, and they would reflect light more adequately. It would be like a sunscreen. And we could hold the temperature rise to its present level, let's say for another 50 years, while we invent really clean energy sources. But at present, we're not going to win the race. We're not going to invent energy sources quick enough to keep temperatures from rising enough to melt all of the glaciers. And of course, the glaciers themselves reflect heat away, don't they?
They do, yes.
And if you no longer have the glaciers reflecting them away, they melt faster, and then they reflect less, and they melt faster. And climate change is now entirely out of human hands. So I am just illustrating, as I say, I'm not at all uninterested in your material that you were thinking about on artificial intelligence. I'm just excusing myself from not giving it my detailed attention.
No, but you just surprised me with this book, because how do you come from the Flynn effect and moral philosophy to the topic of climate change? Where does your mind go? What triggered this?
Well, I've always wanted to be an autonomous human being, and that means you must develop enough critical intelligence that you're not just indoctrinated by the opinions of your time and place and the politicians and the media. And my life, it's true that about a third of my books are on philosophy, which is my main area.
Yes.
But being a philosopher didn't make me think I'm not really interested in whether America might reform its international policy. I'm not really interested in climate change. I'm not really interested in education. I lecture at a university. Of course I'm interested in education. I'm a human being, so of course I'm interested in climate change. If you look at my books on my book page, which you'll find on the web, I think you'll find that the book I'm publishing this year on universities is about my 18th book. Now, if you look at the distribution of those books, they're about 4 on philosophy, 4 on American foreign policy, 4 on the theory of intelligence and the Flynn-effect, and others are entitled the Modern World series, and they're things like climate change and the fact that kids are reading less. And I published a couple of books called The Torchlight List, which tells young people, don't give up on reading. If you read these, you'll never look back. So throughout my life, I've wanted to feel that I had autonomy on the issues that are of great moment. And no particular field has monopolized those issues. They're not all in philosophy, they're not all in psychology.
I have 3 more questions that are about you, and those 3 are the following. What projects are you currently working on? You've already given me some hints.
Well, currently I have coming out my book on the universities that I told you about.
Yes.
It'll be out in September. And the book I'm working on for next year is entitled The Shape of Things to Come, Twilight of American Capitalism. And it's about the fact that climate change and automation are going to force Americans to introduce a society much more like Scandinavia, where there is public contribution to things like medical and health and education. That as climate change and automation bite, Americans are going to be quite unwilling to trust half of their population to the mercies of the market. So the first book I'm working on, as I say, will come out this year on university education. The second one will be a diagnosis of what problems American capitalism faces over the next century. But by the way, in researching that, I've also researched the problems that climate change will hold for China. And they are infinitely worse than the ones for America. China has huge coastal cities, and thanks to pumping groundwater, a lot of these cities have subsided below sea level already.
Yeah.
And the proportion of resources that China will have to devote to sea level damage is much greater even than what America will have to devote. So even America will have 2.4 million people displaced, but the Chinese might have 50 million people displaced.
Amazing. Holland as well. Don't forget Holland, because we are below sea level as well.
Well, Holland, of course, you have a tradition of building dikes.
We do. We do.
I can't imagine you can build them as tall as the Empire State Building. Sooner, the Dutch, you're probably aware, profited a long time from the Ice Age, because the fulcrum of the Ice Age was north of Holland, and that meant that the ice that's south of the fulcrum tended to depress land. And the Dutch, for a long time, after the Ice Age, the land in Holland kept rising. And this was sufficient to offset sea level rise. But that stopped. You no longer have the added virtue that your land, thanks to the Ice Age, is still coming upward.
Exactly.
Gone.
Exactly.
You're now faced with sea level rise just like the rest of us.
Yes.
And God knows what you're going to do over the next century.
Oh, God knows. Well, my second penultimate question is, what unanswered questions from your field of science do you hope to find answers to?
If you mean for writing beyond what I'm doing now, I of course I will keep trying to be a climate change evangel and speaking, but if you mean books.
No, I mean research. I mean from your field of science, the Flynn-effect.
That's right. The research I'll be doing, let's say, over the next 3 years. Now, certainly I'll keep my hand in the intelligence area, but my main research is going to be on why is America so strange?
Strange?
About a third of the people in America, it's as if about a third of the population were sent to Mars in 1890, and their brains are put in a deep freeze,
Wow.
And now they've just come back again.
Wow.
And why is this? Why is it that you still have people with a 19th century mentality, about 35% Americans who think that human beings and dinosaurs coexisted? And you don't find this in Holland, or you don't find it in Britain.
No.
You find some nuts in these places, but not enough to elect Trump.
No.
And what is it about American history that has frozen the minds of Americans in this strange, peculiar way? So I intend to do a lot of research on that. I'm curious. I'm old enough now that before I die, I want to answer problems about which I'm curious.
Yes, problems that won't be answered in America because every scholar will be destroyed by publishing work like that, of course. And my final question for you is,
What's the final question?
my final question is, if you would have to describe yourself in music and books beyond your field of expertise, books that interest you, 3 books and music you listen to, just to give a picture of who you are.
A picture of what?
Everybody knows Dr. Flynn from the field of intelligence. Most
people just know about me because of the Flynn-effect.
Yes, but
Of course, the Flynn-effect has just been one facet of my intellectual life. The most important books I think I've written is on the status of ethics and why people should be moral, which you'll find in my philosophy books. But I haven't just been it was a sideline for me. I've never read a textbook in psychology, nor have I ever had a course in psychology. But I got terribly interested in the race and IQ issue, probably because when I was in the South as a civil rights worker, I was persecuted so much for working for black equality. And that's how I really got into psychology and discovered the Flynn-effect semi-accidentally. So I realize that's why I have an international audience, but that doesn't show the limitations of my intellect.
no. Now I was just wondering, you as a person, you in one of your talks you referred to the fact that you are an athlete, you like to do sports. I mean, what kind of books do you read? Who is Dr. Flynn in his leisure time?
Well, what books I read very widely in literature, and I read a lot of history. If any American policymaker had read the history of even one book on the Middle East, they wouldn't have done anything so silly. So I love reading history, biography, and literature, but I also keep up in philosophy and in the psychology of intelligence. But I must admit, I've made most of the contributions in those 2 fields that I think I'm capable of making. The areas I'm trying to weigh in now are other areas like climate change and encouraging literacy and university reform.
Interesting. And do you listen to music? What kind of music do you listen to?
Music, yes. But my son, who's the mathematician, like so many mathematicians, when he was small, his mathematical aptitude went with composing music.
Okay.
I had mathematical aptitude too, but not as great as his. But I have never been able to compose music, but I love Mozart, Bach. Modern music, I start losing it after the early Prokofiev. I enjoy music up to about 1920.
The Romantic era.
What has come along since? Much of what's come along since are musicians composing for other musicians.
Yeah.
I mean, the music I really love is Bach, Mozart, Brahms, some of the early modern composers like Prokofiev, Tchaikovsky. But yes, I have a very lively interest in music, but purely as a passive listener.
I see. Are you ever going to retire, Dr. Flynn? Is it ever enough? Or will you just keep writing until the very end?
What did you say?
Are you ever going to retire, or is it never enough?
Oh, am I going to retire?
Ever, yes.
Is that what you asked?
Yes.
Well, I'm never going to retire from thinking about problems that interest me.
Yeah.
The university still let me teach a 4/5 load, and I think in recognition of my age, that's going down to about a half load next year. But I very much value contact with my students, if only to wake them up.
Yeah.
So I certainly enjoy teaching. Probably by the time I'm 90, I'll not be teaching anymore, but if I haven't lost my mental capabilities, I'll certainly be working on some research.
Yeah, what's amazing how people like you... Well, in 2 weeks I'm interviewing Albert Bandura. You refer to his work as well. 94 is still fit. So
Bandura.
yes, in 2 weeks.
Yes, Bandura researched to about the age of 94,
Yeah.
and Bandura, you know, was the teacher of the fellow Sternberg.
Okay, yeah.
Robert Sternberg, the triarchic.
Yeah, I interviewed him.
Bandura was a teacher of Sternberg, and Sternberg is also very much interested, not just in my views on the theory of intelligence, but the other areas that I've taken a look at.
Yeah.
Because he too is convinced that the big problem for the next century is not rising IQ,
No.
encouraging improvements in education.
That's why his triarchic model, he added wisdom to it. Because that's what the world needs, wisdom.
You recall, if you've read the second half of my book, you'll find that I find a place for the triarchic model.
Yeah. And wisdom is an important addition to that model as well.
That's right. Wisdom, IQ does not equal wisdom. You'll find that
Exactly,
even when
yes.
I wrote the book,
Yes.
the first book, you know, What is Intelligence?
Yeah.
And I published a book entitled How to Improve Your Mind,
Yeah.
which is an effort to give university students who have been badly educated a better education.
Yeah. Well, let me end by thanking you very much for your time and effort. And
No, I very much enjoyed talking to you. It's been good to talk to you. I'll say goodbye then. Bye-bye.
okay, bye.